Hey there guys, it's Metro, and as the return viewer among you will know, I've spent a lot of time testing tanks on the Battle for Azeroth beta over the last few months. As a part of learning all 6 tanks enough to make proper comparisons, one of the main talking points has been Azerite gear and how it might empower each spec, and as with legendaries, might make some actually overpowered. A few months ago, I made a video discussing every single class-specific Azerite trait that was relevant to all the tanking specs, and while reading through them, I was actually really impressed with just how many were patching holes ripped out by the loss of artifacts, and how some others were adding dynamic new playstyle changes to classes that offered incredible power-ups for using certain combinations of spells well. So after dozens of hours I've spent testing this, I was genuinely surprised to see just how many people are still excessively confused about the traits and their purpose. This came to a head in the most recent Q&A, where a question was asked that implied that Azerite traits were very weak and had no impact on the playstyle. Game director and guildmaster of elitist jerks Ian Hazakostas disagreed and went on to explain a few cases where he found this to be the complete opposite, all in all answering the question in a very respectful way. Then, to no one's surprise, a forum thread popped up essentially talking about how clueless Ian is, and that him thinking Azerite traits aren't boring must mean the development has no clue what they're doing. A direct quote from this thread is as follows: "Facts are facts. The community is speaking and Blizzard isn't listening. The fact of the matter is that Azerite gear is garbage. Yes, the legendaries we may have had have changed since the first major patch in Legion, but you forgot that we had artifact traits to go along with those legendaries, and most gold traits were actives, not passives." So, obviously the poster is very confused on many of these topics, and especially after having spent so much time testing Azerite gear, I was really disheartened to hear such negativity about a topic the person clearly has not done any meaningful interaction or research on. There's an insane amount of misinformation and overreactions on this subject, and clearly people are not on the same page if anyone is saying something like all gold traits were active, not passive. With all this in mind, in today's video, I will remedy this problem with an informational look at what Azerite gear actually is and what it's actually meant to replace, why the system is solid and an improvement from previous systems, and also why the future of the system should be very bright. Let's get right into it. Azerite gear. What is it? Azerite gear is gear with no secondary stats on it that can only be placed in shoulder, chest, and helm slots, that contains various power-ups built directly into the item's value and given a specific UI to design such. In order to understand fully what Azerite gear is, we must first understand the previous iteration of these systems though. In Legion, we had many new systems that contributed to the unique customization paths given to our characters, including artifacts, their relics, and legendaries. They were all new concepts with Legion, and even though they were controversial at first, now that Legion is over, they can comfortably be looked at as an inventive new way to give powerful choices to the player that require them to not only just level once and choose a talent point, but to actually play the game heavily and grow a collection and comprehension of the many options. The most prominent of these features was of course the artifact weapon, which was removed with patch 8.0 along with its many traits and relics. The artifact featured a new progression system that was originally looked at as a parallel to old talent trees of the early days, and on top of the relic system offered many choices to be made in the first few months of Legion. Eventually, the system fell flat as people fully progressed and filled up all the possible options in the weapons, and many people simply ignored the customization featured within relics, as item level and weapon damage often outranked the traits themselves. In the end, we were left with our main form of customization being legendaries, unless you want to constantly replace relics, that is, despite all that was discussed before Legion. In BFA's development, the designers realized that even though the artifact was supposed to be this unique source of decision and power, by the end it was very much ignored and dug a hole that would be tough to return from with the dozens of power-ups available within. Flash forward to the present, and this time a new route was taken, where the main item you will empower is a single neck piece that every class and spec in the game will have a copy of. Instead of empowering it with multiple traits, it will instead gain item level and stats for every artifact level, and the levels themselves will correspond directly to a new type of item, Azerite gear. As explained earlier, the gear offers multiple choices within that offer power-ups for your character, but also features spec-specific choices, so you aren't labored with getting multiple sets of items in order to play different specs within your class. The neck itself is also similar. There's only one neck item, so no matter what spec you play, you will empower it equally and the same, and the power of the neck will directly correlate to the availability of the traits on said Azerite gear, which will increase in requirement based on the difficulty of the content you are doing and progressing through. With the basics of the Azerite gear out of the way, again, in order to understand what Azerite gear actually is, you must also understand what it is not. Azerite gear, what it is not. Understanding what Azerite gear is not is actually the key to understanding precisely what it is, how it will operate, and what we can eventually expect from it in the future. The systems we described before, including artifacts, relics, and legendaries, but also including tier sets, are all things that were revealed in BlizzCon 2017 to not be making the journey with us into Battle for Azeroth. The artifact itself was revealed to be a temporary thing way back in a Legion launch interview, but no matter how much time we had to prepare ourselves, it was always going to feel like half our power and customization was ripped right out of our spines. I'm not exactly sure when this happened, but for some reason, with the removal of these systems in mind, many people assumed the Heart of Azeroth neck piece and Azerite gear specifically would be a one-to-one replacement for all of these Legion systems, including the artifact. To this day, I still cannot find any explicit connection between the two, but it was likely derived from some ham-fisted transition between topics at BlizzCon or the like, and it has caused untold confusion and frustration ever since. In order to continue from here, you have to understand one very important thing. Under no circumstances are any combination of these items expected to be directly comparable to the artifact weapons, which featured incredibly detailed and unique models and animations, custom and impactful lore, and dozens of very, very strong power-ups. But at the same time, the artifact itself doesn't want to be a better version of the BFA features either. They are very different and really do not serve the same purpose for our characters in any way, but it is an easy target for comparison because the artifact was supposed to be billed as this vast tree of choices and power-up routes that it eventually failed to be. As we progress through BFA, it's best to look back at the artifact as entirely pruned from the game's existence. If that upsets you, it's understandable, but it should not be related to your opinions on Azerite gear in any way. And even if Blizzard explicitly said word for word that it should at some point in the past, you should realize that they were wrong. The two systems are simply nothing alike, and no comparison can be drawn on any real level between them. However, the Azerite gear actually does resemble another Legion-specific system quite closely, and that is the focus of comparison everyone should be making and we will make in the remainder of this video. I am, of course, talking about Legion legendaries. Why Azerite gear is the thing BFA needs the most. So now that you know what Azerite gear and what it is not, it's pertinent to understand why this next iteration of character customizing gear is not only another attempt, but a logical improvement. If you aren't familiar with how legendaries operated, they featured one very powerful effect on an otherwise normal item with full stat budgeted secondaries and primary stats, but with a dramatically increased item level compared to what was available. You could originally only wear one legendary, but eventually you were able to wear two via research that required many weeks of a gated questline in your order hall. That is, of course, if you actually owned two. Probably most notable about legendaries is just how difficult and convoluted their acquisition process was, and in my view, it is the single greatest flaw with an otherwise amazing expansion. Legion legendaries were billed as classic world BOE epics in that they would be so powerful and unique that you would be very excited to finally see them drop, but as only Blizzard can manage to derp, they managed to misunderstand why that system was memorable. The fact that those items were BOE. In order to acquire legendaries, you basically just had to keep doing things until they eventually dropped. There were various ways to help you get them along the way, but the long and short of it was, out of a pool of 12 plus for each spec at launch, you would get a completely random one in a near completely random time with no recourse for selection and no chance to reroll or trade them in. Whatever else legendaries were, this is what they will always be remembered as by many, and the biggest RNG driven system ever in the game, and one that was attached to enormous power gains that simply were not optional if you wanted to perform at the best that you could. Flash forward to Battle for Azeroth and we see that problem is entirely solved thanks to Azerite gear. They drop from specific bosses, just like any other gear in the game, and instead of having to worry about getting ones for specific specs like legendaries, the items feature options that you can choose and re-choose for a nominal gold cost that doubles each reroll, but decays gradually over time. For anyone spurned by early bad luck with legendaries like myself, this system is a breath of fresh air, as it features a similar amount of customization that is in line with legendaries, but with many chances to experiment and very little luck involved. Explicitly, there is no chance of Titan forging, gem sockets, or anything else random about the item. They will always have the exact same trait for every class every time they drop from the specific source. Problem solved, right? Well, what about what the actual traits do? So now we'll discuss Azerite Traits and why they'll be even better than legendaries. One of the things that has been so frustrating over the past months when discussing these items is that many people seem to be heavily fixated on the perceived lack of unique elements these traits offer. Like the quoted OP from the introduction, many seem to think that previous systems showered you with active abilities that redefine how you play your spec, and minus the fact that every legendary in the game outside of the triumvirate trinkets were passive, to some degree, this person would be correct. Legendaries offered very powerful selections, but as mentioned, they came at a great cost when the items themselves were randomly awarded. This led to a very large distinction in the system's delivery. Legendaries that offered DPS, and legendaries that offered utility or survival. One of the best parts of both systems is that you can dramatically alter the things your class is good at any given time by simply switching around the gear you're wearing. And this was very obvious in the Legion legendary system with options like Pride as Neck, which gives a massive absorb shield, or Agrimar's Boots, which gave dramatic speed based on secondary stats. The problem is, if those were the only two that you owned, you'd be the fastest, bulkiest guy at the bottom of the DPS meter. For the legendary system, there were a lot of options, but few choices. And as you could only have two on at any time, you'd often be forced into cookie cutter setups based on the task you were trying to tackle. Regardless of the strength of the Azerite traits, an unmistakably amazing part of the system is that, as there are different rows of traits on each item, design was able to separate the utility and survivability traits from the throughput traits. For example, Death Knight's specific first tier might feature a trait that gives you its chance to get a second bone shield charge every time you use Marrow Rend, but on the innermost tier, it might feature a trait that puts a Pride as like absorb on you as one choice, or a speed stat bonus after March of the Dam expires as another. This alone should have people through the moon, as Harry might say, as no matter what happens, it will immediately offer far more opportunity to out-prepare situations and give the player a much better chance to impact their playstyle without having to make severe sacrifices elsewhere. But no matter how important all of these features of the system can be, there's of course still the elephant in the room. So, the question everybody wants to talk about and everybody wants an answer to: Azerite traits. Are they interesting and powerful? Now, before we answer that, it's important to understand that the class-specific traits so heavily discussed are not the only traits or options featured. For your standard endgame item, you'll have 3 class-specific traits on the first tier, which will heavily impact a specific spell or interaction, and 1 for each spec you might have, and then 1 generic trait that just offers some auxiliary power, usually with flavor related to the zone in which it dropped in. It's the most talked about choice, but there will also be other points of power-ups which will require an increasing amount of Azerite power as described earlier. The second tier will be an assortment of different power-ups which sometimes feature specific stats or situations, but will not be specific to classes in any situation I have seen thus far, and usually feature something for survival as well as stat and DPS increase. The third tier will feature pure utility options, which usually involve things like mobility, class-specific types of utility, or even situational bulk. And the final point of investment increases the overall item level of the item itself to cap off your progression through it. With that understood, there's another important point that cannot go underestimated. As mentioned, there are 3 items total you can have equipped in 3 slots, and on those 3, you have the possibility of having 3 of the same trait selected, and they fully stack with one another. This is obviously unique to this system, as legendaries could never be doubled up on, and again is easily one of the major reasons the system will have a lasting impact that many people seem to want to simply ignore. But I know, all this talk and still nothing about the power they bring. So, the best way I find to address this is for you to find the link I have in the description and check out the traits for your spec and class specifically. As you read through them, remember that all of these traits can stack with themselves and each other, creating interesting and powerful synergies, but that they also scale in power based on the item level of the item. I'll give 2 examples to illustrate the power of these items from my extensive testing on the beta. Protection warriors have a trait called Deafening Crash that makes Thunderclap increase the damage it deals by a certain amount and extend the duration of any active demoralizing shout on enemies hit with Thunderclap by 1 second. The amount that Thunderclap is increased is fully stackable and will of course depend on the power of the item, but more interesting is the fact that the extra second it increases can also stack. Now, I made a thread on this on the beta forums attempting to learn more about what can and cannot interact stacked this way, and it does seem like some things have caveats to prevent them from getting overpowered. For example, last I tested, if you had 3 stacks of this trait and applied Demo Shout to many targets and Thunderclap them all, it would only increase each by 1 second. But if you used it on a single target, it would increase it by as many seconds as you had traits. I'm not sure what it is and is not intended here, and no one seems to actually be testing this stuff, so the thread has fallen to the wayside, and that means we may never know until the full release of the game. Regardless, this is powerful in its own right, but remember, Warrior also has a talent to increase the range on Thunderclap and also decrease the cooldown on it while Avatar is up. This leads to a situation where, if prepared, a player can have tremendous uptime on Demo Shout, which is significant as it's the only reduction in the game that can be applied in such a way and reduce magic damage taken to the tank. This is a great example of the power and customization these traits can offer, but there are also ones a bit more straightforward. For example, sticking with Prot Warrior, the trait Blood Sport, which increases the amount Ignore Pain absorbs and grants you Leech for 8 seconds. People might say, oh, this is a boring trait. It doesn't impact your play anywhere near as much as the one we discussed previous. But of course, if you have high item level versions of this trait and you can stack 3 of them, you're going to find yourself with an awfully high amount of Leech, suddenly making Ignore Pain a much more desirable rage dump, especially considering the Leech will persist even if the absorb is used. In my experience, this type of oversight is made very frequently, and these traits might appear boring or weak at first, but this is only the case because the person seeing them is not thinking with a progressive mindset and is disregarding the possibility of them getting stronger and stronger as the expansion goes and we progress further. Another more clear example is Blood DK's Embrace of the Darkfallen. Whenever vampiric blood expires, your leech is then increased by a specific amount for 10 seconds. This trait is particularly interesting, as hopefully everyone knows that Blood DK lost Umbilicus Eternus, a famous gold trait from the artifact, which offered huge secondary upside to the CD Vampiric Blood, an already strong defensive CD, but synergized heavily with other traits like stats, haste, and strength, and of course the infamous talent Red Thirst. Embrace of the Darkfallen is never going to be as powerful as Umbilicus Eternus alone, but consider this. When testing the traits on the beta, I was able to see heroic raid quality traits thanks to the PvP realm, that being item level 375 fully upgraded pieces. Each Embrace of the Darkfallen trait at that item level gave 359 leech, or 8.6%, and of course, fully stacked, meaning you could have over 26% leech for 10 seconds every time your vampiric blood expired, which of course can be heavily reduced based on Red Thirst and the amount of haste you have. And that's only from heroic of the first raid, commonly used as a buffer before the real raid progression begins in the expansion. So to summarize, the individual spec-specific traits alone will never come close to equaling the power of a single legendary, but no one in their right mind should be expecting that. You can have 3 of each trait, stacking sometimes in very powerful ways, and the power of the traits often increase heavily based on the item level of the item, which obviously is going to increase drastically throughout the progression of the expansion. This alone makes them better than legendaries, as it allows for dramatic power increases as progression continues, but of course, the main traits always discussed aren't the only options, and undoubtedly, you'll see very high impact second and third tier talents as well. That's not even taking into consideration the raid specific traits that seem to be in the game, where the selected trait gives a normally budgeted power up, but also grants unique power in the raid zone specifically itself too, similar to the Pantheon trinkets from Antorus the Burning Throne. The final thing we'll discuss here today is Azerite Gear's bright future. So after all this discussion, it should be quite obvious that with 200-ish item levels ahead of us, some of these traits are going to become extremely powerful over time. Knowing what we now know, it should not be a stretch to say that this system will launch with even greater potential than any of the previous ones. Many of the primary criticisms of the system happen simply because people are only looking at leveling quality trait values and not taking into account how these things might stack together and interact with stats. For as silly as thinking a very small number on a very low item level item is indicative of the overall strengths of the entire trait is, it's equally silly not thinking about what that trait might offer when the item is 100 plus item level stronger than the version you're looking at. This will be squarely problematic in the Mythic plus dungeon landscape, as the items you might acquire from the weekly caches will likely go from well over 340 to well over 440 by the end of the expansion. Does that mean that the Embrace of the Darkfallen Fallen is eventually going to give 100% leech when fully stacked, thinking about this immediately presents a problem that Blizzard will have to tackle, and the fact that it's on the table this early pretty much dispels any notion that these traits simply aren't powerful enough. Even if all of this wasn't true, yet another key insight is often conveniently overlooked. Consider again the legendary system as the natural predecessor of the Azerite gear, and remember just how many things were actually changed from Legion launch to the last days of Legion. Chances are the legendaries you most frequently use today weren't even available at launch, and the ones that were possibly retuned or even redesigned at some point throughout the expansion. Think about the massive buffs that Prydas and Cephas have seen over the expansion, and legendaries like Soul of the Death Lord, which offers you a second talent choice that simply wasn't available until halfway through the expansion. Clearly, even if you think the system we have in the game now is weak or boring or whatever else, if you compare it again one-to-one with legendaries, you should know that the Azerite traits will continue to get more interesting and more unique as time goes, and the ones we already have will only be getting stronger. Finally, to properly illustrate the future of the system, one final comparison can be considered. Many people lament the idea that tier sets were removed to make way for Azerite gear, and unlike the artifact comparison, it's definitely not unfair to expect these items to fill those shoes as well. If that is what you were thinking, remember that Emerald Nightmare, the first raid of Legion, didn't even have tier gear, whereas by the time we're going to be done with Oldir Mythic, the first raid of BFA, some traits will already be pumping out power gains that frankly sound overpowered. In reality, if these traits accelerate at the level they seem to be going at and are allowed to stack and double dip with each other and other stats, the system will likely increase our power at an alarming rate and cause massive problems for balancing and controlling the rapid power gains at the peak of progression. So essentially the complete opposite of what everybody seems to think is going to happen. Alright, so if you made it this far, give yourself a pat on the back. You now have just spent more time learning about Azerite gear than thousands of forum posters put together. For the sake of completion, a TLDR summary of everything discussed in this video is as follows. The Azerite gear concept seemingly has been misunderstood from the very start, and many people expected it to do something that it frankly could never do. Unrealistic expectations, tied together with inexperience and a lack of testing, has led to a very odd situation for the development team. The general populace seems to think these items are exceedingly weak and boring, but in practice, they appear to be very spec-defining and frankly overpowered once the power curve gets properly rolling. In truth, everything that was good about legendaries are present again in Azerite traits and much more to come. You no longer have to hope you get the ones you want. You no longer have to choose between utility and throughput. You can collect as many as you want to mix and match frequently, including between other specs within your class, and you could even respec the traits that you chose on items for a small fee that does double but decays pretty rapidly over time. The Azerite traits fully stack and combine with each other and themselves, unlike legendaries, and will have dramatic gameplay impact when combined with high secondary stats, certain talent options, or other power-ups that we might see in certain raid encounters. The Azerite gear cannot be traded, can never Titan Forge, cannot proc tertiary stats or gem sockets, and only has primary stats on it to dissuade the concern of having to deal with secondary stat balance. As far as I see it, the Azerite traits are going to be a very fun way to increase power customization, and unlike previous systems, will allow a lot of choice and customization immediately. They are the logical solution to every major problem Legion gearing had, and regardless of what you think of the traits, there are enough options to always create something interesting, and more will of course come in the future. And as if a cherry on top, all of these things finally together mean it won't require tons of tedium to keep alts as powerful as our mains after the artifact knowledge sets in. So, if you're coming to these realizations for the first time, the only thing you should really be concerned with is, given the lack of effort you have put into learning up until this point, how are you going to find the time and drive to get the artifact power required to actually be able to use these traits once you've gotten the gear? I hope this video has helped you and everyone else get a more realistic and down-to-earth understanding of what Azerite gear is and why it will be so unique, as well as set a clear expectation for the continued innovation and improvements in subsequent BFA patches, including the gear. As always, I try to read and reply to every single comment on every single video, so if you have anything you'd like to discuss at this point, feel free to do so. If not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.